join me in welcoming Professor Sheila Miyoshi Jaeger from Oberlin College. She is the Henry Luce Professor, Assistant Professor of East Asian Studies, and an anthropologist by training. She got her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, but she really identifies herself as a historian more than as an anthropologist. So it's also interesting for us to see some of the sort of the border crossing between disciplines here. Professor Jaeger is a Korea specialist. She has published a book in 2003 from M.E. Sharp entitled Narratives of Nation Building in Korea, and is presently editing a volume that I've also been involved in, entitled Ruptured Histories, War Memory and the Post-Cold War in Asia, that is forthcoming from Harvard Press. And it's a collection, it's based actually on a fabulous conference at Oberlin a couple years ago, right? 2 years ago, almost. Bringing together scholars from across Asia, Korea, China, and Japan specialists mainly, on talking about how has memory of this war changed since '89, since the end of the Cold War. And especially today, we're talking about, we're just on the same panel actually at the Association of Asian Studies Convention a couple weeks ago in Chicago, thinking about how do things look different in the context of the 60th anniversary compared to 10 years ago, the 50th anniversary, when this whole memory of war issue was out there dramatically. How have events here, 9/11, etc., shaped the way we look at this history in different ways? So today, Professor Jaeger will speak about memory of the Korean War in post-Cold War Korea. So very happy.
Before I begin my talk, of course, I'd like to thank Professor Sarah for inviting me today. And I'd like to say that the talk that I am presenting actually comes out of a larger project, which Professor Sarah already mentioned, entitled Ruptured Histories, War Memory and Post-Cold War in Asia. And this volume is a product of a symposium that I organized at Oberlin in 2003. And it includes essays by Carol Gluck and Franziska on post-Cold War Japan, as well as other essays on China, as well as wars on Vietnam and Korean wars. And basically all the essays in the volume address how memories of Asia's modern wars have changed or not changed in the context of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 and the end of the Cold War. So this paper comes out of this intellectual project. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I wonder.
Yes or no?
No.
A little bit.
I don't know. Have we had this before? I don't know what the fan situation is like.
I'm just coming off of a cold. and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. While the Cold War continued in outer form on the Korean Peninsula as a standoff between the two Koreas at the 38th parallel, this tension masks an undeniable shift that has taken place within South Korean society with regard to the normalization of this brutal conflict. After the West's victory in the Cold War, the South Korean government and the public have been forced to draw a line under the narratives, the historical narratives that had sustained their nation since the Republic of Korea's founding in 1948. Under the authoritarian regime that led South Korea into prosperity during the Cold War period, the Korean War was really critical in creating support for the state's national security and economic policies. However, the dynamics of democratic transitional politics after 1989 have forced the South Korean government and the public to rethink this history in light of North Korea's demise in order to accommodate a new understanding of the war that could promote the peaceful reunification of the two Koreas. Now, one of the showpieces of this new historical revisionism is the War Memorial Complex of Chunjing Ginyongwan. Originally conceived and planned under the No Tae-woo administration, the memorial, which is this huge museum park compound of over 20,000 square meters in size, and which was built in downtown Seoul, opened its doors in 1994, with additional structures built on in succeeding years. Now, the War Memorial provides a fascinating microcosm in the way in which some threads of South Korea's treatment of its wartime experience have changed over the years, initiating what I have termed a post-Cold War narrative of the Korean War. Now, this storyline is particularly visible in the main museum complex, and which has become an integral part by the South Korean government to instill a new version of the wartime past in order to facilitate the reunification of the two Koreas. Now, following the election of the opposition leader Kim Dae-jung in 1997, and the transition to multi-party democratic politics, another structure was added to this museum compound to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Armistice signing on July 27, 2003. The Korean War Monument, which is the first of its kind in South Korea, is representative of a second and more wide-ranging historiographical trend in South Korea, what I term a post-Korean War historical revisionism. And what I hope to show is that the Korean War Monument aims to redefine Korea's wartime experience by commemorating the tentative end of the war. Instead of looking at the beginning of the war, it's now looking at the end of the war. So by inspiring a tacit forgetfulness of the actual brutality of the war, the Korean War Monument's primary purpose is to inspire a pan-Korean nationalism between North and South Korea and peaceful reunification of the two Koreas. Now, related to this rise of pan-Korean nationalism in contemporary South Korea is the issue of anti-Americanism. Following their successful co-hosting of the 2002 World Cup, South Koreans have become increasingly confident in their nation's stature in the world. At the same time, however, growing resentment of South Korea's perceived client status to the United States has led many South Koreans to question the continuing logic of the U.S.-South Korean alliance that was forged during the Cold War. As was the case of radical anti-Americanism during the 1980s, the idea of Korea as a victim state was transformed in 2001 into a popularized form following the accidental death of 2 schoolgirls caused by U.S. military vehicle. Commemoration of Korea's newest victims became an unexpected source for the creation of a new nationalism, inclusive of both Koreas, North and South Korea, against a common foreign foe, the United States. Riding this wave of anti-Americanism into the Blue House in 2002, Roh Moo-hyun was able to make use of this anti-American sentiment to fuel a new pan-Korean nationalism whose aim is to overcome the legacy of the wartime past to secure a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now, an important feature of the history of South Korea is that it is a Cold War creation. The Cold War project dominated South Korea's historical course with its birth in 1948 and the end of authoritarian rule in 1993, coinciding almost exactly with the beginning and the end of the Cold War. Conceived by the United States as a key component, along with Japan, of a Northeast Asian bulwark against communism, the history of South Korea was inextricably intertwined with U.S. Cold War interests and policy. At the same time, however, South Korea's status within the American containment structure created undue opportunities for economic growth, prompted by massive aid by the United States. Moreover, its definition of prosperity, security, and legitimacy was profoundly penetrated by the perceived necessity of maintaining a continuous war against communism in general and North Korea in particular. Now, especially under the military regimes of Park Chung-hee, maintaining a continuous war against communism facilitated the creation of the conditions and the momentum for continuous development, aiming towards ever greater prosperity, security, and legitimacy. So South Korea did not simply exist within, nor was it dominated by the regional Cold War waged by the United States, but it also appropriated and it mobilized the Cold War for its own nationalistic purposes. In this domestic project, too, the United States was a key historical agent, for it was the source of Cold War legitimacy and material largesse. Nationalism in this context was transformed into a statism that privileged anti-communism over unification. Now, the positive uses to which the wartime experience was put thus formed the conceptual point of departure on the part of the South Korean state to turn South Korea's engagement in its continuous war with North Korea and communism into a powerful source of domestic mobilization for the purposes of creating and enhancing the legitimacy of its economic and national security policies. In particular, Park Chung-hee and his military successors were especially skillful at shaping the nation's collective memory of the Korean War experience by using the power of the state to reinforce, refine, and manage this grand narrative. North Korea's record of intransience and provocation facilitated and legitimized this continuous war paradigm. Now, this collective memory, together with the state's increasingly tighter control of South Korean society as a normal consequence of wartime mobilization, created a new social and cultural environment within which Park Chung-hee could carry out his national revolution. So by intent and design, and supported perfectly by North Korea's provocations throughout the 1960s and 70s, Park Chung-hee and the South Korean military dictators were able to portray an intransient and demonized North Korea on which to base their authoritarian actions in the name of urgent economic development and national security. Now, efforts to revise this continuous narrative of the Korean War, and especially the demonization of North Korea, began during the mid-1980s, following the brutal suppression of the Gwangju Uprising in May 1980 by Park Chung-hee's military successor, Chun Doo-hwan. The domestic challenges to the state's legitimacy after the suppression of the Gwangju Uprising and this continuous war narrative that had sustained South Korea throughout the Cold War were as much influenced by internal forces as by global changes. And in the wake of the nationwide pro-democracy demonstrations of June 1987 and the impending collapse of European communism just 2 years later, then President-elect Roh Tae-woo was forced to respond to the changing domestic and global situation. Declaring an end to authoritarian politics, No accepted the formal opposition's demand to and held direct presidential elections. Now, one of the first things that the No administration did was to normalize South Korea's relations with the Soviet Union. Nordpolitik, which No's new foreign policy came to be known, came to mean economic penetration into the socialist bloc countries and the achievement of South Korea's predominance over North Korea in line with a drastically changing international climate. Prodded by South Korea, The Soviet Union was transformed over the next 2 years from godfather, superpower guarantor, and economic benefactor of North Korea to partner and, in some respects, client of South Korea. Now, all these events, which came on the heels of South Korea's global coming out party during the Seoul 1988 Olympics, also provided the pivot for South Korea's new foreign policy initiatives towards North Korea. No's drive to establish relations with the allies of North Korea as a new pragmatism and reform efforts began to sweep over the communist regimes in the Soviet Union and China and Eastern Europe was calculated to alter the strategic alignments around the Korean Peninsula and so induce North Korea to join the international community. Now, it was during this climate of reform that the reinterpretation of history became an issue in the leadership. In the Cold War, the continuous war paradigm and national struggle against communism and the North Korean threat had shaped South Korea's image as a developing nation under siege. In the era of reform, and particularly after the collapse of European communism, the leaders turned their attention outwards onto the world stage, confident in their new status as a global economic powerhouse. The stark reality between a rich and powerful South Korea and an impoverished and isolated North Korea could no longer sustain the continuous war narrative that had sustained South Korea during the Cold War. In other words, a new story of the Korean War had to be written, one that would mobilize South Koreans in tacit forgetfulness of North Koreans' criminal responsibility for the war, while simultaneously holding North Korea accountable for the nation's family tragedy. Now, these new interpretations of the war are strongly visible in the War Memorial Complex, one of the showpieces of Noteru's presidential legacy. Indeed, the War Memorial provides a fascinating microcosm of the way in which the continuous war narrative that had sustained South Korea throughout the Cold War has been, in effect, thoroughly revised. Whereas the Cold War narrative of the war places North Korean invasion and brutality at the center of the story in order to prevent the wounds of the war from healing, for the purposes, obviously, of enhancing the legitimacy of the South Korean national security state, a new narrative is now engaged in what might be called collective forgiveness or forgetfulness. The Cold War that ended in victory for the South Koreans, although it did not end the Korean War, ended in bitterness for the North Koreans. Nevertheless, it proved impossible to fashion a narrative of triumph, since the task at hand was to finally end the Korean War and bring about the two Koreas' reconciliation. Forgiving North Korea's past wrongs by incorporating them into a narrative of post-Korean family tragedy, however, would allow the South Koreans to exclude all that was important from the new Korean War history, while also commemorating the war as a national tragedy. Now, built in Yongsan-gu, adjacent to the U.S. Army base in the center of Seoul, the War Memorial Complex is arranged in 8 main sections, but it is the Korean War room that I want to focus my attention here. Notably absent from the displays are any depictions of the brutal struggle between North and South Koreans, which is the fundamental narrative running throughout South Korea's previous history of the Korean War. While the Korean War room does provide the standard overview of historical events that led up and through the war, its treatment of North Korea's role in the war is largely abstracted from the brutal history of that conflict. Indeed, one of the striking features of this exhibit is its downplaying of anti-North Korean rhetoric. The viewers are presented with a chronological history of the war, illustrated by various dioramas and photographs of wartime destitution and poverty to illustrate the tragedy of the conflict, not its brutality. It is only in the context of the previous understanding of the war that the shift in interpretation marked by the War Memorial can be properly understood. Here's the picture of the War Memorial. Now, absent from the narratives are any bloody battle scenes, including all references to North Korean atrocities committed during the war. For example, the successive purges of South Korean sympathizers after Seoul was occupied by the North Korean People's Army June 1950, for example, and the brutal execution of both American and South Korean prisoners of war by the North Korean People's Army are nowhere to be found in this exhibit. But besides the expulsion of the standard chronicles of North Korean people's killings of South Korean civilians from the narrative of the war, of course South Korea committed its own share of atrocities, the sheer brutality of the conflict is essentially glossed over. In a war that has been particularly remembered for its viciousness, the dioramas and photographs used to illustrate the wartime experience all engender a kind of tacit forgetfulness. This forgetfulness is made possible by focusing on universal themes of wartime suffering, enhanced by the dioramas depicting scenes of dislocation and poverty. For this to happen, the conflict had to be abstracted from history, war as a terrible tragedy. Now, Paul Fussell has described the standardization of language in the discourse of post-World War I Britain, and in particular, the provision of a ritualized, stylized language that was employed to overcome the horrific reality of war and thus to render it publicly transmissible and binding rather than repulsive. The War Memorial, too, is saturated with language of this sort. Words like sacrifice replacing with the words death, soldiers being referred to as heroes and martyrs, whose, quote, spirit of national self-defense has, quote, protected the nation throughout the ages. By subsuming the memory of this conflict as part of a greater struggle, national struggle, that has defined Korea's spirit of national self-defense since ancient times, the War Memorial is able to abstract the war experience into a larger story of Korea's heroic overcoming of adversity. And what is surprising is that the War Memorial of the Korean War martyrs are supposed to be remembered in relation to a long line of historical martyrs who have sacrificed themselves in defense of their country. And this theme repeats itself in the Hall of Heroes that contains the sculpted busts of Korea's famed patriots since ancient times. National history is told in flashback. Here, Goguryeu's struggle against the Sioux Chinese in 598 AD becomes the ancestral predecessor of Yi Sun-shin's 16th century struggle against the Japanese and South Korea's recent struggle with the North Korean communists. In this way, history becomes the continual development of the same. The Korean War, in other words, is subsumed within the memory of all other wars, at the same time that the War Memorial becomes the repository of all of Korea's past and future. Now, the inclusiveness of this heroic narrative of timeless struggle thus masks the distinction between North and South Korean soldier, as the sacrifices made by the South Korean war martyrs are connected symbolically to Korea's heroes before the division and thus before the war. Indeed, the link made between Korea's ancient wars and the Korean War as one long line of historical continuous struggle shows just how the War Memorials attempt to resuscitate a common past, a past that could serve to unite both North and South Korea in a shared remembrance of a tragic war that the museum guide explains must never happen again. But the war that must never happen again came dangerously close to being repeated in 1994. Just as the War Memorial was preparing to open its doors to the public, the first nuclear proliferation crisis of the post-Cold War period began to unfold on the Korean Peninsula. As the Cold War thaw had given over to a new post-Cold War freeze, Kim Il-sung, who was the former opposition leader who had joined the ruling party in 1990, became the first civilian president to succeed Roh Tae-woo in 1993. When North Korea declared that it would withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on March 12, 1993, Kim reacted angrily, charging that North Koreans were trying to buy time to finish their nuclear project. As tensions began to mount to a crisis level, Washington proposed a deal. North Korea would freeze its nuclear program in exchange for 2 proliferation-resistant light water reactors and a supply of heavy fuel oil. The signing of the agreed frameworks in October 1994 put a temporary end to the international tensions that had been building in 1991 over North Korea was back in the news again in 1995, this time by making an unprecedented appeal for international aid to cover a food shortage brought on by bad weather and poor harvests. Reports of widespread famine and malnutrition led the Kim Jong-sam administration and other world leaders to believe that North Korea was on the verge of imminent collapse. But North Korea's imminent collapse failed to materialize, and it was in this context of continuing tensions in North-South relations that Kim Dae-jung, who was elected in office in 1997 as South Korea's first president from the opposition, attempted to completely reorient his government's policy towards its northern neighbor. Domestically, the ascendancy of Kim Dae-jung administration in 1997 marks a period of economic crisis and reform. The story of the near collapse of South Korea's economy after the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the economic miracle of South Korea's recovery from that crisis need no retelling here. But what does bear repeating is that it was in the seesawing climate of economic and political reform during the late 1990s that Korean history once again became highly contested. Now, in his article on Tiananmen Square, Woo Hoong describes what he sees as a complex relationship between memory and event. Memory, though invisible and hidden, bridges separated events into a continuous process, so that with every new and momentous event, like a death of a leader or a national crisis, the memories associated with the particular memorial change, while the memorial itself often assumes a new identity. Now, something similar has also occurred at the War Memorial. This transformation, however, signified not so much a change in the memorial's overall meaning as much as a shift in emphasis. Whereas the theme of national reconciliation and peace had always been present throughout the War Memorial, the narrative of South Korea's victory over the North is also an equally dominant theme. This victory narrative did not undermine or otherwise contradict the memorial's message of peace and reconciliation. Rather, the reunification message was predicated upon the South's forgiveness of North Korea, and hence was premised upon this idea that the two Koreas would eventually reunite under the banner of the South Korean flag, the authentic and legitimate Korea whose affluence and prosperity represented a clear contrast to the poverty-stricken, isolated, and totalitarian North Korean state. Now, the Statue of Brothers, which is located on the left-hand side of the memorial complex, demonstrates this complex message of reconciliation and triumph explicitly. The enormous discrepancy in the size between the two figures reveals how the forgiving embrace of the larger and stronger South Korean soldier of his weaker and smaller North Korean brother demonstrates this rhetoric of familial unity or reunion could also be written to show the defeat of communism and the victory of South Korean democracy. Moreover, the notion of national rebirth, which is symbolized by the cracked base, that is the Shilla tomb, and the Shilla was a southeastern kingdom of Korea, and it unified the peninsula in the 7th century, evokes this idea of hope, birth, national renewal, reunification. So rising out of this tomb, the reunified peninsula is born again as a nation of brothers, although clearly South Korea, the South Korean elder brother, is far more powerful and hence far more legitimate. But these themes of competition and victory are clearly absent from the newest monument to be added to the War Memorial Complex. Unveiled during the commemoration ceremonies of the 50th anniversary of the Armistice signing on July 27, 2003, the Korean War Monument represents a significant departure from themes of triumph which characterize No's Nordpolitik. The new era of reconciliation in contemporary Korean affairs has seen a multitude of new interpretations of Korean history. Among these is a new understanding of the war years and of North Korea. On both the cultural and diplomatic fronts, a new and strikingly positive portrayal of North Korea as fellow sufferers of a tragic division were evoked in the popular media and press to legitimize a completely new diplomatic initiative towards North Korea. Kim Dae-jung's new diplomatic effort, known as the Sunshine Policy, initiated a revolutionary new perspective of North Korea. And while it is beyond the scope of this talk to elaborate in any great detail on the details of Kim's Sunshine Policy, its basic approach to dealing with North Korea has brought about a marked change in the way in which South Koreans have assessed their wartime past. The Korean War Monument, in other words, is just one of a widespreading, wide-ranging historiographical trend, revisionism in early 21st century South Korean academia, popular press, television programs, and even films. Its focus is on ending the war and thus moving beyond the conflict in the hopes of achieving a permanent peace. Now, the shift from remembering the start of the war, June 25th, to commemorating its tentative end, July 27th, itself signals the creation of a new national strategy of memory through forgetting. What is being remembered here is precisely the tentative end of the war, the armistice, the signing of the armistice, and the fact that the North and South Koreans are one people. How and why the war began is being forgotten. Korean unification and the peaceful resolution of the unfinished war thus becomes the vehicle for remembering painful wartime memories, while at the same time allowing South Koreans to forget the divisive role that North Korea has played in those memories by focusing on themes of future peace. This message of future peace through the celebration and commemoration of Korea's ageless unity is a theme that also appears in the Korean War Monument. Now, at the center of the Korean War Monument is the June 25th Tower, which represents, according to the manual guide, a new beginning. Molded in the combined form of a bronze slim dagger, which symbolizes Korea's eternal history and marks the spirit of the Korean people, and that of a life-giving tree, which symbolizes the peace and prosperity of the Korean people, the tower symbolizes, quote, the rise of the Korean people from the ashes of war, while also representing the spirit of martialism and an image of peace. Now, while the tower, which marks the beginning of the war, was also supposed to demonstrate its end, a promise made to future generations that the fraternal war would never happen again. As the 50th anniversary of the Korean War Commemoration Committee put it, quote, the erection of the war monument is testament to the promise of eternal peace to our descendants. Now, the use of the Korean slim dagger as a centerpiece of the Korean War Monument is itself very significant, because, as Hung Il-pei has noted, it has become identified among Korean nationalist historians as a racial marker of a distinct prehistoric Korean archaeological culture. A unifying symbol of the two Koreas, ancient past, its combined form of a life-giving tree also connotes the nation's future rebirth. Like the Statue of Brothers, the idea of national rebirth through the peaceful reunification of the peninsula is a common theme. But in the case of the Korean War Monument, however, allusions to a North-South struggle and reconciliation are strikingly absent. What is being commemorated is the suffering of war and the struggle to overcome it, with the shared commemoration of a common ancient past. Now, this common past is represented by the stone wall, which symbolizes the Korean peninsula, upon which is etched copies of prehistoric Korean rock drawings, signifying Korean unity. To get at the heart of the Korean War Monument, we must descend into the stone wall area and enter beneath the stone bowl, which seemingly supports the tower, and which holds, quote, the spirit of the Korean people. Now, in all these layers of symbolic meaning, the stone wall, the stone bowl, the June 25th tower, all express hope for the rebirth of peace among brothers, which union would bring. It is significant, then, that the statues defending the nation, which surrounds the bronze dagger, is the only part of the Korean War Monument where direct references to the wartime experiences are made. For the 38 figures, which is obviously an allusion to the 38 parallel, represents people of all social standings who collectively overcame the difficulties of war and symbolize, quote, both the suffering and pain of the Korean War and the noble spirit of self-sacrifice and martial self-defense historical martyrs honored throughout the war memorial for their sacrifices to the nation in other wars. The Korean War Monument thus commemorates the Korean War as one long line of historical wars in which the Korean soldier was acted upon to defend his country. The ambiguity of the June 25th tower reiterates this message, for there is nothing specific about the events of 1950-1953 that is being commemorated here, since what is being represented by the bronze dagger and the life-giving tree is, quote, the eternal history and the martial spirit of the Korean people. It is the Korean spirit of national self-defense represented by the South Korean soldier, but also indirectly incorporating the North Korean people as part of the nation's common legacy that is being commemorated. It is also notable that the commemoration of the UN participation in the war, like that in the war memorial, is significantly marginalized. Placed on the stairwell leading downwards from the stone bowl into the stone wall, the 21 poles, which obviously symbolize the 21 participating nations, are almost invisible from the entrance of the war memorial. Their invisibility matches the striking visibility of the bronze dagger that rises above the 38 statues announcing Korean unity and future peace. The Korean War Monument, then, is a monument to national unity achieved by the martyrdom of the South Korean soldier. Nevertheless, his sacrifice is abstracted from the Korean War experience itself. What is being commemorated is the spirit of sacrifice, that is, one sacrifice in a long line of similar sacrifices taken on by the universal Korean soldier in defense of his nation. In this way, the Korean War Monument continues the main theme of the war memorial, which is devoted to commemorating not a particular war, but a long history of wars on the Korean Peninsula from the 4th century onwards. The particularity, in other words, of the Korean War experience itself is subsumed within a general narrative commemorating the spirit of national self-defense. Now, the addition of the Korean War Monument in 2003 thus casts new light upon the meaning and emphasis of the War Memorial Complex. Far from this triumphalist tone of the Statue of Brothers, and indeed of the entire War Memorial Complex itself, the Korean War Monument is distinguished by its emphasis on a shared national tradition going back to prehistoric times. In this way, the Korean War Monument is placed between the Statue of Brothers to its west, which sits on the Shilla tomb, and the stela to King Kwanggaeto, the great king of Goguryeo, which sits to its east, is very significant. Shilla was the ancient territory of Korea, which roughly correlates to the boundaries of contemporary South Korea, whereas North Korea now occupies the lands of the ancient northern kingdom of Goguryeo. North and South Korea, like the ancient kingdoms of Goguryeo and Shilla, thus meet together under a united symbol of shared Koreanness, represented by the Korean War Monument, the ancient bronze dagger of Korea's eternal past and its eternal unified future. No longer separated nations, the Korean War Monument recalls a time before the division, and indeed before the Three Kingdom period itself. Thus, it's worth emphasizing that the statues defending the nation face both east and west, both towards the Statue of Brothers and towards the stela of King Kwanggaeto, as is to embrace the legacy of Shilla and Goguryeo history within the two Koreas' contemporary fraternal struggle. Settlement of the conflict is resolved through the commemoration of a common past and future. The Korean War Monument, then, is a monument to national unity, achieved through the commemoration of Korea's spirit of national self-defense that has guided all Koreans throughout the ages. Now, whereas the Korean War Monument was given license to be the first officially sanctioned narrative to treat this new interpretation of the Korean War, popular history aimed at a mass audience soon followed behind. Now, one such topic has been the alleged massacre of Korean civilians by American soldiers at the village of Nogomli in the early days of the war. The Association Press first broke this story in September of 1999, and since then it has stirred considerable controversy both in the United States and in South Korea. The report, which received the Pulitzer Prize in 2000, and the restraints moved by the end of military dictatorship in South Korea, have resulted in the creation of wealth of new monographs by respected South Korean historians devoted to what they term uncovering the hidden history of the war. Indeed, within this genre, various formally off-limit topics have now been written about extensively, and this also includes research into U.S. conduct during the war. The Nogumli incident has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been one of the first major events to come under scrutiny in recent years. While the details and the controversy surrounding Nogumli scholarship is sort of beyond the scope of this talk, what is of relevance here is the topic of alleged U.S. wartime atrocities has created a literal industry of new historical works devoted to re-examining the relationship between the United States and the South Korean government both during and after the war. The end of the Cold War, democratization, and the reconstruction of wartime memory in the 1990s has meant that the perception of the United States' role in the war has undergone considerable reevaluation by South Korean lawmakers and historians, a dramatic shift from its perception of its role as savior from communism to perpetrator of war crimes. Demands for justice on behalf of the Nogumli survivors has primarily fed into a new and popularized narrative of the war that began to emerge during the 1990s, that of Korea as victim. The Korean past informs the present. The attack on innocent Korean civilians and their victimization has fed into an age-old image of Korea as a victim, not just of Japanese colonialism, but of an entire history of foreign aggression. And it's this history of victimization and Korea's simultaneous triumph over it that the War Memorial and the Korean War Monument commemorates. The Korean War Monument in particular reveals this message explicitly. The statues defending the nation are configured in such a way as to show both the adversity faced by the Korean people, depicted on each end by the frail and pathetic poses of an old man and woman, and their triumph over this adversity, symbolized by the strong and masculine figures of the Korean soldier. These powerful and triumphant figures lead the people by embodying the nation's spirit of national self-defense against the foreign foe. Now, the controversy surrounding Nogumli scholarship thus resuscitates the basic themes of the War Memorial, not of anti-Americanism, of which there is no hint, but this narrative of Korean victimization and eventual heroic triumph. The commemoration of the two Koreas' spirit of national self-defense, embodied by the shared symbol of Koreanness, the bronze dagger, was calculated not only to bring about the strategic forgetting of the brutality of the war and memories of North Korea's role in that brutality, it also sought to re-remember the war by invoking the familiar narrative of victimization from which the two Koreas would eventually emerge triumphant. The link to this new remembering of the war in contemporary South Korea has been also a mushrooming of new citizens groups and movements devoted to bringing about the peaceful solution to the North Korean nuclear crisis. Now, these organizations have demanded a final end to the Korean War, and they're also imbued with distinctly anti-American overtones. While anti-Americanism is not new to South Korea, what is new is that anti-Americanist sentiments appear to have spread in almost all strata of South Korean society, ranging from elite government policymakers and intellectuals to members of the middle class to the younger generation. A recent public opinion poll reveals that more South Koreans find the United States a greater threat to their national security than North Korea. While the sources of these tensions are many, it is the changing perception of North Korea that has had the most profound impact on U.S.-South Korean relations in recent years. Now, at the core of the U.S.-South Korean alliance is the presupposition of a common North Korean threat. It was the Korean War that led to the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and South Korea in October 1953. And for nearly 50 years, or half a century, the Cold War and the common memory generations of South Koreans who grew up after the war, Americans recovering from the trauma of 9/11 regard North Korea as a rogue state intent on pursuing nuclear weapons in defiance of international agreements and widely proliferating arms and missiles. Whereas the Cold War continues in the United States under the new guise of the new war on terrorism, it is irrevocably ended in South Korea. The disastrous US-ROK summit in March 2001 and George W. Bush's denunciation of North Korea in his Axis of Evil speech and his State of Union address on January 29, 2002, reveals a fundamental disjuncture between American hardline and South Korean engagement policies towards North Korea. Now, this policy conflict over North Korea has in turn fed into popular anti-American sentiments in South Korea, a powerful current that current President Roh Moo-hyun rode into the Blue House in 2002. Indeed, in February 2003, Yoon Young-wan caused consternation in Washington for allegedly preferring a nuclear North Korea than a collapse scenario. Though he later denied that this was the policy of the No administration, his statement was widely taken as illustrating No's ostrich pacifist approach, that is, a military solution to the conflict was unthinkable. In a major speech in Los Angeles in November 2004, President Roh Moo-hyun shocked Washington by declaring that there was some justification for North Korea's claims to a right to develop nuclear weapons and missiles in order to protect itself against an American threat, though of course he did not name that threat. And in January 2005, South Korean Unification Minister Chun Doo-young, in a major speech in Berlin, styled Korea the greatest victim of the Cold War and stated that South Korea would not back down on its principles of no war, peaceful coexistence, and common prosperity. One U.S. government official described South Korea's position as tantamount to, quote, suicide terrorism. Now, it is in this climate of what I term post-Korean War politics that the reinterpretation of South Korea's relationship to the United States has become an issue in the leadership, which has also helped to bolster a new kind of pan-Korean nationalism rooted in South Korea's image as victim. In this new narrative of the Korean War, the Korean past also informs the present, not just the period of so-called anti-American imperialism, but Korea's entire history of struggle against the foreign foe. Achieving peace and ending the Korean War meant not only overcoming the Armistice and the Cold War logic that maintains the old order by creating a progressive peace system between the two Koreas, but also linking Korea's record of resistance against foreign aggression to serve as a lesson for the present. And herein, I think, perhaps, lies the deeper meaning of the Korean War monument's bronze sword, the commemoration of the spirit of the two Koreas' shared spirit of national self-defense against an ongoing threat of foreign invasions and would-be oppressors. But these images highlight the other side of Korea's image as a former great power that has been able to resist invaders in the past. By commemorating Korea's spirit of national self-defense, North Korea's role in instigating the Korean War is forgotten through the celebration of a new brand of pan-Korean nationalism. This nationalism resurrects the dichotomy of Korea as victim and hero, not just centuries of shared national victimization experienced at the hands of foreign invaders, but Korea's shared triumph in overcoming these challenges to their national sovereignty as well. So in this reinterpretation, North Korea's past transgressions are forgotten and forgiven in order to foster a new nationalism, inclusive of both Koreas, by finding a common enemy to oppose. Now, it is in this context that we must understand the national furor that was caused by the accidental death of two Korean schoolgirls by two American soldiers on June 13, 2001. The facts of the case are fairly well known. Two middle school girls were going to a birthday party in Uijeongbu, which is located just north of Seoul. They were walking along an edge edge of a two-lane highway with a grassy bank rising just off to the right. A convoy of U.S. armored vehicles belonging to the 2nd Infantry Division were also on the road. 2 armored vehicles had already passed the girls, who were walking on the pavement because there was no shoulder. Their heads were down and their fingers were in their ears to block out the noise. But the driver of the armored vehicle that killed the girls, the 3rd or the 4th in line of the column of military vehicles, did not hear this vehicle spotter warning him of the girls present because of a faulty headset. The girls were run over and killed. It was a tragic accident. Now, while the deaths and the later acquittal of the U.S. soldiers responsible for this accident created a national furor in South Korea, spurring a wave of anti-American protests throughout the nation, and a literal industry of conspiratorial theories ranging from reports that the soldiers had killed the girls on purpose to charges that the soldiers had laughed off the incident. What interests me here is how this tragedy became entangled in the thickets of memory politics. The deaths became linked to South Korea's neo-colonial status, which primarily fed into this image of Korea as Hitler. The deaths also became connected to a whole array of issues related to Korea's history of colonialism, which played upon this trope of a violated motherland that must recover from foreign occupation to achieve its former greatness, independence, and reunification. The deaths also became symbolic of South Korea's client status under the U.S., and demands to revise the status of force agreements created a popular constituency in South Korea, arguing that foreign imperialists were once again trampling upon the sovereignty of the Korean nation and impeding the path of reunification. Connecting the deaths of the girls with South Korea's client status and American efforts to impede the reunification of the peninsula, the invocation of a common enemy, the United States, has been used to foster a new nationalism inclusive of both Koreas. Indeed, riding this wave of anti-Americanism, then presidential candidate Roh Moo-hyun stated just days before the close of an extremely tight presidential race that he might favor neutrality if war ever broke out between North Korea and the United States, an extraordinary statement coming from one of America's closest allies. The deaths of the schoolgirls then became a vehicle for re-remembering and forgetting a host of issues related to colonialism, war, the division of the peninsula. The intensification of memory and identity struggles in South Korea in recent years, best exemplified by the Korean War Monument and the new remembering of July 27th as a day of pacifism and peace, met the growing desire of the South Korean people to search for an alternative view of the war years, including new interpretations of U.S.-ROK relations. Attempts to rewrite North Korea back into a shared and ongoing history of national struggle and triumph over foreign adversity, the spirit of national self-defense, that was crystallized in the planning of the war and later highlighted in the Korean War Monument, reveals the growing desire for the normalization of relations between the two Koreas. Now, this new obsession with peace and the highlighting of the Armistice agreement as the new key event in war commemoration reflects the shift in South Korea's post-Cold War, post-Korean War consciousness from a war narrative to a peace narrative. This shift has also brought about a fundamental reevaluation of U.S.-South Korean relations in the aftermath of the Iraq War. The legacy of the unfinished war that the United States is now seen as perpetuating. Efforts to finally end the Korean War reveal how pan-Korean nationalism and the current struggle over how to best deal with the North Korean nuclear crisis are intimately caught up in the politics of memory and South Korea's need to accommodate North Korea into their past and their future. Thank you.
That was a fabulous talk. Thank you so much.
You can actually show that last image.
The last image again. Wanted to spotlight you for a change. You want the last image again?
Well, this is this one. Yeah, I think that is very interesting because it
much for struggling through this less than ideal conditions of talking over this fan. To me, this was very, very interesting. Also very much because of the complete absence of Japan, so, you know, which I think some of you might raise. But I would like you to have a chance to ask Professor Jaeger some questions. Why don't we start with you, Peter, and then we go on. Speak up, please.
We talked about South Korea's memory of the war, but can you just speak a little bit about how North Korea remembers it, and if there was a shift in that?
That's a really good question, but we don't know anything about North Korea. That's the problem. It's such a secretive state. So it appears that North Korea basically continues to have the same, which is that there was a war of national liberation from the yoke of American neo-imperialism, and that it had tried to unify the nation. That's basically their narrative of the war. That the South Koreans have been basically captive to the forces of American imperialism, and they had tried to save their South Korean brothers, but had not succeeded. So, and that continues basically until the present, which is why there's a sense of defense, right? In the sense that they have to defend themselves against the outside world.
So if there is that secrecy and like not knowing exactly what
If it's
North Korea
changed.
thinks about the whole thing, then like why is South Korea so hopeful of reunification? Because obviously I don't seem to like it doesn't seem possible that North Korea would accept this sort of idea like like the whole statue of brothers statue of South Korea's like victorious and like accepting that. Like why are they so like just optimistic about sort of reunification?
Well, because I don't think so. I mean, for the knowing younger generation, they don't see any other alternative, right? And there's this whole idea too that, despite the fact that they are two separate nations, politically they are one people. They speak the same language. They have 5,000 years of history. So the division is unnatural. And so the only way in which to get over the war, end the war, is to embrace them as brothers.
I would say that in the United States, generally Americans perceive Kim Jong-il to be essentially like a maniac, someone who's insane and has total control over the regime over there. The South Koreans have a more tempered view of him because we've seen that under the American view, unification would be thoroughly impossible with as long as he was in charge.
Well, I mean, they think that by continuing to give to North Korea, right, incentives, money, food, that eventually they will want to change, and that they will eventually open up to the world, and that Kim Jong-il is a rational human being and can be persuaded through incentives, right? But of course, the American view of him is completely different. So there's a completely opposite way in which to approach the North Korean problem. But for the South Koreans, there's no other way because war is impossible. You can't have war. So the only way you can do it is through incentives towards the Kim Jong-il regime to change eventually.
That's another question.
Has there been this change of view of the war? Has there been a backlash from South Koreans who fought in the Korean War?
Well, that's a very interesting question because there is a generational shift, right? The people who are now in charge are people who grew up with no memory of war. Right? They're called the 386 generation. Those in their 30s were actually now in their 40s, went to school in the 80s and were born in the 60s, right? And these people, their biggest memory was struggle against dictatorships, South Korean dictatorships. So they didn't have memories of war. And so their idea is that you can get along with the Kim Jong-il regime and continue to engage with it. Of course, the previous generation who actually fought the war have a completely different idea of North Korea, right? So there's a completely opposite view of how to resolve this issue. The problem, of course, too, is the human rights problems in North Korea. Because the current administration, the Moon administration, ignores the human rights issue, right? And so there are people within that generation, or the younger generation, who are saying, look, we can't just continue to support the North Korean regime and ignore human rights, right? So it's true that this view is not just a homogeneous view that all South Koreans now embrace, but it is the view that the South Korean government embraces.
I also wanted to quickly welcome you guys from the AP History class. I'm quite thrilled that you could come. And encourage you to participate in this conversation. I know it might be a little scary, but you know what? We all do this. So if you want to participate, please feel free to do so. And let's take a few more questions on this. Maybe somebody wants to relate this to what we've been talking about all semester. In a way, we made a big leap forward here. So to what extent does this connect?
I should also say that anti-Americanism in South Korea is on the rise, as well as anti-Japanese feeling. I don't know if you've been hearing the news about in China, there's anti-Japanese demonstrations, where they also going on in South Korea as well, though they're not covered as much. But the Nomigan administration, the current administration in power, has created these what they call truth commissions, and they're looking into investigating all the abuses that the Japanese did against them during the colonial period. Korea was a colony of Japan for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, and so this has also been a big issue, right? So there's this whole anti-Americanism and anti-Japaneseism that is also fostered to create this kind of mutual, this kind of shared history with North Korea, because of course North Korea share this victimized history with the South, right? So this victimization goes beyond just the anti-American feeling.
Can you give us a bit more explanation on how you define anti-Americanism in South Korea, or anti-American sentiment from President Roh? You mentioned in the talk that President Roh campaigned on what you call the anti-American platform and numerous implications. But where do you draw the line between anti-Americanism and simply trying to reassert independence for South Korea on the world
That's
stage?
a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think they're both sort of interrelated in that sense. I mean, anti-Americanism can be expressed through the burning of the American flag, the burning of effigies. During the 1997, for example, there were posters put on restaurants, no Americans allowed. Even currently in South Korea, there's now instituted a policy of buddies where soldiers cannot leave the base without the protection, or can't leave the base alone, they have to be with another person. There's also curfew. So there's a sense that South Korean feelings of not welcoming or anger towards the American soldiers specifically, and that's how it was sort of defined. But you're right in terms of anti-Americanism and the assertion of independence. They're really basically one thing.
Is more differentiation needed then to distinguish against these soldiers other soldiers or American civilians encountering some sort of hostility or resistance or discrimination versus South Korea just trying to say, look, we want to claim our place with the G8 rather than be treated as a perpetual client state. To me, that latter strain is not anti-American. It's simply just trying to reassert its legitimacy.
Right, but by doing that, though, you have to claim a certain distance from America, and those are expressed often through anti-American feelings. Right? So you will have demonstrations about SOFA, for example, the status of force agreements, where they're arguing about certain legal status that the American soldier has, and they want to change that. Or you'll have demonstrations in front of the U.S. embassies. Okay? Those are all part of anti-Americanism within the umbrella of trying to create a distance and an independence for something.
What is the sort of current view of China? Because obviously they're also an aggressor in the Korean War. So is the blame sort of shifting away from North Korea towards China, or do they see themselves as having kind of stuff in relation?
No, actually, contemporary South Korea have a love affair with China right now. China is in, Japan and America is out. So that's a very interesting forgetting too, because
from Professor Dutton early in the semester, very much the Korean-Japanese relationship and how much Korean nationalism has been built on this, and a unified Korean nationalism built on an anti-Japaneseness. When does this change, or how do you, when does anti-Americanism come in? Are they both sort of, they're not sort of equal there, right? When do you see those shifts, vis-a-vis Japan? I mean, anti-Japaneseness is still around, but to what extent, what you were talking about seems to be replacing in some way the anti-Japanese nationalist rhetoric.
Well, I think the discourses are together. I mean, they're layered. I wouldn't say one fits the other. I mean, what's interesting about the war memorial is it's really a whole history about Korea's victimization. So beginning from the 4th century, Korea was invaded by this tribe, and then it was Manchuria, but it kind of withstood, and then it was invaded by this tribe, and then Hideyoshi went and tried to convert it. So all these narratives of victimization become one, and the American narrative is just one of the long line of the same. So there's nothing really specific about that narrative.
How much Japan is in there? I mean, how many dioramas depicting brutalization? How many comfort women are there? I mean, how much of that?
That's not very much at all.
It's very interesting.
There's very little in that.
And the only other thing that I wanted to ask is, in the absence of having any info on how North Korea commemorates this in terms of monuments, I am totally struck by the iconography of this monument. It's socialist, as far as I can tell. I mean, when you look at museums in the Soviet Union, in East Germany, in the East Bloc, the kinds of heroic figures, the very realistic-looking people and so on, that's very much, and off you go, these kinds of statues are so much part of socialist iconography, whereas in the West we've had much more sort of abstract stuff. I'm just struck by that.
Any ideas why? I don't know. That would be like, I guess my next project, figure out like why, what connection there are.
Interesting.
But if you look actually at North Korean monuments and the newest, they're very similar. I'm not sure, maybe there was sort of an unconscious way in which they wanted to sort of mirror the similar kind of
Most of the contemporary memorials look very different. Well, I'm very happy to